So welcome to Glasgow Loves EU, and this evening we're speaking with James O'Brien. James O'Brien's a radio presenter, an author, a podcaster, and a TV presenter. He hosts a very successful podcast called Full Disclosure with James O'Brien. He's an avid anti-Brexit campaigner, and he participated in the People's Vote for a second Brexit referendum. He's recently authored two books, How to Be Right and How Not to Be Wrong. And he's previously been referred to as the conscience of liberal Britain. So welcome, James, and thanks for talking to us. Okay, we seem to have lost the sound. Maybe Bernd is helping us with IT this evening, so maybe he could sort that out. And then we've got Dee, who'll be taking your questions on social media. So if you have any questions, you can pop them into Facebook or Twitter for us. So James, if you can hear us, obviously you hardly need any introduction, but normally we'd ask our guests to give a summary of their career so far, how you got to be presenting on the TV and ranting about Brexit every day.
I'll give you the potted version. I was selling suits on Regent Street, having been rejected by pretty much every journalistic outfit in the country several years running. I think I was on my third or fourth year of applications. John Major, all the tailors were off sick, so I got sent to Downing Street to sell John Major a suit because he was a client of the shop where I worked. He bought a white suit in the midst of his portrayal on as being a very grey and boring man, so I thought that's got to be a story. I found out the Daily Express offered the gossip column the story, risking my future in menswear, obviously, with this epic indiscretion. They offered me a few £100s for the story. This is back in the days when Fleet Street had money to spend. I asked for a couple of shifts instead. I got a couple of shifts. I got in finally through the door at the Express. Ended up showbiz editor there, then went off to do TV, and then sort of landed at LBC almost 20 years ago. And it's not a job I ever had any ambition to hold, but it's by far the best job I could ever have hoped to have. And the show just keeps going from strength to strength.
Fabulous. Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously an avid fan of the show, so listen every day. It's fantastic. And I've also read your books, and in your recent book, you speak about the type of schooling that you had. And you were in school with people who are now like running government, and the schools, you say that they were preparing pupils to lead the country. And so my question is, do you think that type of schooling is still relevant for leading the country in the 21st century?
No, I think it equipped you appallingly. I went to a school called Ampleforth, which is widely, it's going through a terrible time at the moment, but it's widely regarded as the sort of top Catholic public school in the country. Most of the ruling class, in the context of the last 12 years of government, so David Cameron and Boris Johnson, with poor old Theresa May caught in that particularly unappetising sandwich, they obviously went to Eton, as did Jacob Rees-Mogg and various others, but there's a certain type of schooling that I think was formulated as a way of training men to run the empire. So it had to equip you, and I didn't realise this for years, and I was very much an advocate of it, and one of those people who would have insisted that it was good for you and it created strong, robust, resilient people. But what it was really creating was that people who could ship out to the other side of the world and not really feel any empathy at all for the people that they were lording it over, being equipped with, maybe building some train lines or something like that, but they were largely for the business of shipping raw materials back to Blighty or enriching the people who had invested in whatever adventure it was. And the actual people that you rule over were just like sort of chess pieces. And I realised about 5 years ago that this was deliberate and that my schooling had been very much like that. And what interests me and what interested me in the last book is more what it does to you, more what it turns you into. So it turns you into a very fake person, or at least it encourages you to grow layers over the authentic you. So in order to pretend or to convince yourself that you haven't been in some way brutalized by this mode of schooling, you're sent away. You're hundreds of miles away from your mum and dad. You we're very much living by the law of the jungle. I believe it's a lot better now than it was in the 80s when I was there. And in the 80s, it was better than it was in the 60s. And in the 60s, it was better than it was in the 40s. And in the 20th century, it's better than it was in the 19th century. But you have to become something inauthentic in order to survive. And you have to persuade yourself that you're invulnerable and that nothing hurts you and that um, you become conditioned to treat everything like a challenge and a fight that must be won. Never explain, never apologize, never back down, never admit weakness, never admit vulnerability, which probably was a great training for exploiting and lording it over an empire in a very arrogant and exceptionalist way. But it's a horrible training for running a modern democracy. And what terrified me at the beginning of lockdown was that Boris Johnson was going to bring this utterly inadequate skill set to pandemic management. And of course, he did. So when I'll tell you the moment that really chilled me was when David Cameron said after Johnson got the virus, after he got COVID, David Cameron said, "Oh, Boris will be fine. I've seen him play tennis." And that was like the distillation of all the things I've just said to you, as if the way you play tennis in an aggressive and a boisterous and an arrogant way, somehow you'll be able to beat a virus by deploying a sort of blustery tennis persona. And of course, that's exactly what he did try to do. We subsequently discovered, but I didn't know that was going to happen when I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. And you speak a lot about the survival kind of personality, but like how do you explain the kind of risk-taking behavior? Like, so for example, like all the parties during lockdown, I mean, they must have known that this was going to come out eventually. So how do you explain? And in terms of COVID as well, their own personal, they put themselves at risk.
I
Is
mean,
that connected?
I'm not sure that is, to be honest
Mm-hmm.
with you. I think that an awful lot of people who went through that sort of schooling would have come out thinking that they could approach it like they'd approach a rugby match, or they'd approach it like they'd approach a debating session, a debating chamber. I think Johnson is unique in the context of the narcissism that he displays. So I think truly believing that the rules don't apply to him is not typical of the sort of schooling that I'm talking about. And in fact, there's that infamous letter from his High Master at Eton that literally said he seems to think that the rules that everybody else has to follow shouldn't apply to him. So even by the standards of incredibly entitled, privileged public school boys, and we can be an incredibly entitled, privileged bunch, even by our standards, Boris Johnson thought he was above even the requirements of regulation and rules that the rest of us were quite happy to. It just never really crossed anyone's mind that you didn't have to obey some rules. But Johnson's clearly believed for his entire life that the rules are for the little people.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that one. And then just in terms of like education in general, like in England, say the lack of any kind of political education, do you think that maybe would have contributed to the result in the referendum 2016? Or
Yeah, I have to be careful in attributing it to any sort of lack of understanding. So I'll speak about myself. I had a politics A level, um, had a good degree from the LSE. I'd been in the sort of current affairs world for most of my adult life, and I was supremely ill equipped to cast a vote in the 2016 referendum. I knew next to nothing about the salient issues. I went on a crash course just before the vote on what it was going to do with to the island of Ireland, what it was likely to do to the island of Ireland. But even then, people who had spent their entire lives talking about it were still insisting that we'd somehow be able to stay in the single market and pick and choose the bits of it that we would abide by while jettisoning all of the bits that we didn't. And I think naively, and also because I've only become an anorak on this issue since the vote. So, I mean, I didn't put that much effort in. I just presumed that the people who'd spent their whole lives talking about it must have known on some level what they were talking about. And I presumed that people who'd spent decades railing against it possibly knew a bit more about it than I did. And so maybe it would be possible to have freedom of movement of goods and freedom of movement of capital, but not have freedom of movement of labour. And so So yeah, I think obviously there was an educational deficit there. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but I think the levels of ignorance across the entire electorate were pretty epic, and I think the proof of that particular pudding has been in the post 2016 eating, hasn't it?
Yeah. And so you touched on Northern Ireland there, and you often speak on the radio about the footballification where everything is, polarized in politics. And I sometimes feel it's like, Northern Ireland is the football, like, especially when, when last week and the constant threats of like reneging on the protocol. Do you think that Northern Ireland is somehow used as the actual football?
I think that historically, and Scotland probably falls into this category a little bit as well when you view it from Westminster. It's at best patronised and at worst ignored, and so the entire debate was. Theresa May, oddly, before the referendum, was one of the only prominent politicians, certainly one of the only prominent Conservative politicians, to warn what was likely to happen in Northern Ireland. But then once she became Prime Minister, for reasons that I guess we'll have to wait for the memoirs to understand, she never mentioned it again, or she never acknowledged it again. She gave £1 billion to the DUP, despite being one of the only English politicians who understood the jeopardy that the peace process could potentially be placed in. So I think there's a degree of out of sight, out of mind. And I think cynically or statistically, there's not much electoral gain to be had. There's not much rhetorical gain. There's no opinion poll points to be scored by treating Northern Ireland responsibly or by treating Northern Ireland equably as an equal and integral part of the United Kingdom. So I think all political parties tend to ignore it until it becomes unignorable, and then the tragedy of having ignored it for so long exacerbates the problems as and when they arrive. So yeah, I mean, look, how many times, how many issues could we touch upon now of Boris Johnson saying and doing things that are utterly at odds with observable reality, that are somehow beyond lies? It's almost as if in the same way that there's a new category unique to him when it comes to the observation of rules and standards and regulations, so it is when it comes to the truth, because he can stand there with a straight face and say there will be no border in the Irish Sea, that it will happen over his dead body. And everyone who understands the issue at that point knew there was no earthly way they could get it over the line without there being a border in the Irish Sea. And then there's a border in the Irish Sea, and it's the deal that David Frost negotiated and Boris Johnson signed. And before the ink is dry on the deal, they're both trying to disown it. Brandon Lewis is standing up in the House of Commons talking about breaking international law in a very limited and specific way. And we behave still as if the rest of Europe is sitting in a box, in a hermetically sealed box, and they're utterly unaware of what we're doing. And it never ceases to be staggering that that our government behaves in this way, disowning its own legally binding international treaty at the first opportunity, despite having been elected on the back of it being so brilliant. And yeah, Northern Ireland is the most obvious manifestation of that hypocrisy and that dishonesty. And the message to the people of Northern Ireland, whether they're unionists or nationalists or the increasing number of people who no longer define themselves as either, but look instead towards the objective advancement of the nation, the message to them is just screw you. That's the message that's come from Westminster. And it's put the DUP I mean, I don't hold much sympathy for them because they're architects of their own misfortune, but they're now being essentially held hostage by their belief that an emotional attachment to Great Britain is more important than the economic health of Northern Ireland. And it's mad. And it was all avoidable. And it's all self-inflicted. And it's all going to get worse long before it gets better.
I know. I think the situation in Northern Ireland probably makes, Brexit almost unworkable just because it's such a stumbling block, even though there's no value in it, politically for politicians.
But it always was, Jenny, and that's
Yeah.
the most amazing thing. I'll never forget the caller on my radio show, and I was getting schooled on this, despite having a slightly better grasp of it than perhaps anybody in the Conservative Party, or certainly anybody on the Leave side of the referendum debate. A caller talking to me about having, since the Good Friday Agreement was signed, he'd had some work done on his house. And it meant that his bathroom was in the north of Ireland and the rest of the house was in the Republic of Ireland. And the idea that you were somehow going to be able to have two a different regulatory framework in his bathroom from the one that he had in his kitchen was so obviously absurd that when people like Jacob Rees-Mogg kept insisting that there were going to be technological solutions, or that we'd be able to work our way around it, or you just needed to believe more, or that they needed us more than we needed them, I used to sit there feeling, not for the first time, like the little boy in the crowd must have felt when the naked emperor tootled past and all the grown-ups were cheering about how wonderful his clothes were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, it's so true. It's so frustrating. But I'm being told that we've got plenty of questions coming in on social media. So I'll just hand you over to Dee.
I do.
Hi, somebody was obviously listening to your show today, because Geordie says imperial measure is exactly what Johnson is. Give him 2.54 centimetres and he'll take the proverbial 1.60934 kilometres, which I thought would probably amuse you to start with. The other question is a bit more serious. So Richard says, greetings from Southeast England, wants Tory rule to be ended soon, if not Scottish independence. There've been a couple of questions on Scottish independence. So the other one is from More Agnes. Need to swap apps. What do you think the quickest way is for Scotland to rejoin the EU with the UK, or not? And is it better? India is better for Scotland, but which route will be beneficial for the rest of the UK? I'll deal with those now, or if you deal with those now, and then I've got another one to come back afterwards.
I mean, I'm. If I was Scottish, I would now be on the side of independence, but I would have a voice in my head saying, "Are you doing this because of the current government in England, or are you doing this because of the long-term best interests of Scotland?" And I'm not yet confident enough to answer that question. If I was Scottish, I think I probably would be. I'd have done the digging, I'd have done the thinking and the heavy lifting, but right now I don't know that I've got the intellectual heft to nail my colours to that mast. Emotionally, now in 2022, I wouldn't have much hesitation doing it, but as I say, intellectually, and then as an Englishman, or as an Anglo-Irishman, and I've phrased this badly in the past, and you may not have come across this, but the Scottish independence debate can be quite fractious, and feelings can run quite high.
Yeah.
So I phrased this badly in the past, but as an Englishman, well, I don't really feel English. You see, I feel British, so I would feel a sense of loss. And I don't think that matters, and I'm not claiming that should influence anybody's vote or suggesting for a minute that it's a vaguely important contribution to the debate, but I have been asked the question, and that is how I feel. So I'm not Scottish, and so I don't know is the short answer. And as to rejoining the European Union, I don't know that either. And I think, if I pretended I did know, I'd be doing the questioner a disservice, because I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. My belief is that the denial is unsustainable. My belief is that the benefits, I mean, unless we go full North Korea and they close down reports about what's happening in the rest of Europe, I don't see how they can sustain the idea that it was in any way a good idea. But quite what rejoining would look like, or when that conversation would start, I currently have no idea, partly because Keir Starmer, I think pragmatically, is sort of completely ignoring it, partly because Boris Johnson is constantly trying to re-weaponize it, and partly because rejoining would be a much more complicated process than people appreciate. I don't think, for example, we'd be able to do it without joining the single currency. I think that's enshrined in the EU's constitution now for new accessions, and we would just be a newly joining country. We wouldn't be like, Nottingham Forest getting promoted back into the Premiership after 23 years and feeling like we'd never been out. It would be we'd be starting from scratch. We'd be on the same page as, Eastern European countries were on in the early noughties. So I don't know. I can't see any other alternative to it in the context of trade and in the context of, trade almost exclusively, and the labour shortages. But it still feels to me like an incredibly high mountain to get over.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel different when you live up here, which obviously, you know, I only moved post Brexit,
Yes.
and you know, it does feel different when you're here to compared to England. And
I'm sure.
anyway, I'm going to give you another question, which I think is tugging the forelock to my MP, Mhairi Black, who made a fantastic speech in Westminster the other day, which was widely circulated. And it's from Kevin, and it says, do you think that the current direction of travel is heading towards fascism, her F word, or is this a populist bubble that will eventually burst? And then, oh my goodness, there's more coming in.
It could be both.
It
could be both, couldn't it? I mean, that's the thing. One of the reasons I had to leave the BBC many moons ago was because I couldn't express an opinion, like a fear such as the one that Mhairi expressed in the House of Commons, without, well, just having, you know, every right wing newspaper in the country coming after me like beagles after a fox. But you should be allowed to express that fear, even as an impartial, objective journalist. You should be able to say, here are some signposts. I was thinking more about Donald Trump back then.
Mm-hmm.
Here are some signposts that history teaches us often point towards a form of government that is not very democratic. The F word is very loaded, and it conjures up still connotations of Mussolini rather than Donald Trump. But I thought it was a really good speech, and I think if the people who find it offensive and obnoxious have the courage of their convictions, then they shouldn't have any difficulties at all in assuaging the fears that were expressed in that speech. And then the little things, the little pointers, like ignoring independent advisors when Priti Patel was found to be a bully. The fact that, you know, you forget how many of this cabinet have fallen foul of the rules in the past. Even Grant Shapps, people forget Grant Shapps had to resign after lying about what he knew about a man who ended up being accused of all manner of appalling behaviours, being let back into the sort of young conservative or whatever it was called at the time movement. That you know, Patel came back after being done for bullying. You've got various other members of the cabinet who probably would have been fired or expected to resign. Gavin Williamson, I know he's not in the cabinet anymore. He's about to get a knighthood instead, but he gets a free pass despite being not even a bad education secretary. You need to invent a new word to describe how awful he was as Secretary of State for Education. So the cronyism, the corruption, the law breaking, the lying, the weaponization of the other, which is what the whole anti-woke, the ludicrous culture war and anti-woke agenda are about. These are fairly well established tropes. But they could also be, to answer Kevin's question, it could also be a populist bubble that will burst. I don't know. It worries me. But then there's that great book. I forget who wrote it. An American author wrote it in the 30s. It was called "It Couldn't Happen Here," and there is that smug, exceptionalist belief that kind of thing doesn't happen in countries like this until
it does.
Until it does. Until you get, you know, January the 6th in America, and still that continues. So it's a mad time. It's a really crazy time. All my adult life, up until really 20, up until the financial crisis, everything was so normal. You don't realise it, do you? You don't know what you've got till it's gone, as Joni Mitchell.
Anyway, I have more, but I'm going to go back to Jenny because otherwise she won't get through any of her questions.
Oh, that's fine. That's okay.
So when you need a break, come back to me, Jenny, because I've got more.
Okay, brilliant. That's great. I was just going to ask, in terms of your radio show and Brexit, so obviously you get callers every day. Do any of them actually change their minds? And what reasons do they give for changing their minds? What are their kind of light bulb moments?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think there'd be any surprises here. I tend not to get the calls anymore that made me famous, for want of a better word. The viral calls from people that would be absolutely furiously adamant that we had to leave in order to control our own laws, and then they'd be, you know, famously unable to name a single law that they wanted to change. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is now minister for not knowing what laws it is that we were supposed to want to change when we voted to leave the European Union. Whether he's bright enough to realise that or not, I think is questionable. So I've had people burst into tears. One bloke in Exeter, quite not long after the referendum, but they're just looking at it. They're looking at the stuff that's happening. Whether, you know, it's labour shortages, or whether it's queues at Dover, or whether it's the absolute horror show of trying to export to a market that was previously frictionless, whether it's the fact that the German car industry didn't turn up to save the day, whether it's the fact that almost all of the things that were warned about have either come about or may still come about. So I think people, and I'll tell you what hasn't landed yet, which really does worry me. What hasn't landed yet is the fact that immigration is probably going to be higher this year than it was before Brexit. So all of the people, and I know not everybody likes to hear this, but you think about Nigel Farage and his disgusting poster, immigration and fear, very carefully cultivated fear of the foreigner, was a huge part of Brexit. All of the sort of Dominic Cummings lot like to pretend that they were above the fray on all that sort of thing, but they were bang in bed with Nigel Farage. They knew exactly what they were doing, riding the racist tiger and then somehow trying to desanitize themselves afterwards. So when it turns out that the economy demands immigration, it withers without it, I don't know what that's going to do to the people that used to ring me and tell me they voted for Brexit because there were too many brown faces in Tesco's. Because, of course, the people coming in now are coming in from countries outside Europe. So they're coming in from more, choose my words carefully, more observably foreign people are now coming in. So all of the racists that voted for Brexit, and every racist I've ever met voted for Brexit, which doesn't mean everyone who voted for Brexit is racist. It just means that everyone who's racist voted for Brexit. Quite what they're going to do when these numbers start registering and resonating, I don't know. The only difference is, I don't know if this counts as optimism, but there's nothing in it at the moment for the right-wing media. There's nothing in it for them to re-weaponise immigration. You might have a couple of clowns down at Dover with their Fisher-Price binoculars trying to pour hatred at poor sods in leaking dinghies, and Priti Patel might be deporting them to Rwanda as part of her own kind of, I don't know, Cruella de Vil cosplay. But the right-wing media aren't going to weaponise it yet because there's no enemy. If you want to find who's responsible for it, then all roads lead to Downing Street, or all roads lead to the Home Office, and they're currently not ready to do so. You can't blame it on Brussels. That was the mad thing, wasn't it? That I only realised in retrospect. You could have a Conservative government somehow being served by a client media while attacking immigration, even though it was the fault of the government, because everyone pretended it was somehow the fault of Brussels. And two things never happened. It was never actually explained that this was good for the country, and it was never actually explained that the decisions not to control our borders more, which we could have done, were taken by successive Conservative prime ministers, and that's what, and Labour prime ministers as well, and that's why I think even more people might change their mind about it, but for the wrong reasons, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm told that we've got more questions coming in from social media, so just hand over to Dee again.
Okay, I've got a couple of answers actually. One is from Elise, who says, no, you don't have to join the Euro on accession. And Andrew Barton says, Upton Sinclair wrote the book that you referenced.
Upton Sinclair, that's the fellow. I think you do have to join the single currency on accession. I'll be corrected on that if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly sure I'm not.
Well, anyway, that is something to find out. Right, so going back to Bill, is the problem less about knowing policies and more about recognising one's own ignorances? The easy solution to the latter being to loudly confidently voice uninformed prejudice in preference to researching and listening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's Andrew Bridgen, isn't it? That's just been described there, a man who appeared on Irish radio claiming he was entitled to an Irish passport by dint of being British, and then when the truth emerged, he doesn't even pause. He doesn't pause for a nanosecond to think, hang on a minute, if I'm completely wrong about that. Dominic Raab saying, after becoming Brexit Secretary, oh, it turns out that trade between Dover and Calais is rather more important than I realised. Yes. How can that not shake one jot your confidence that you're correct about the wisdom of leaving? If things that you believe to be true, that are apparently an important part of your conviction that you're right, turn out in real time before your very eyes to be completely wrong. And so I don't know what I think it's not unique to this era, and it's not unique to this country, but yeah, people, loudly ignorant, confident people, we're back to the kind of schooling that we began talking about at the beginning, and the ability to win an argument or to win a debate in those sort of environments, even if you're wrong, is valued far too highly in this country. And I'm allowed to say that because I used to do it all the time. I was a national schools public speaking champion. So I was brilliant, if you'd allow me to be immodest. I was brilliant at debating and I was often wrong, but I'd still win.
And well, they actually teach you how to debate the argument you don't agree with.
Yeah, and it's great for the trophy cabinet. It's not exactly very good for government, is it, or democracy, when the people winning the arguments are demonstrably wrong. They're just better at arguing.
Aye. Anyway, a couple more about Scotland and Northern Ireland are not going to go away tonight. So one is, how do we make Scotland and Northern Ireland unignorable, which is an interesting word.
Yeah.
And another one on Ireland. Do you believe that a united Ireland is inevitable and maybe the only Brexit benefit?
I totally believe that now. In my lifetime as well. I think, I mean, don't know what the alternatives would be. It's far from simple. You need a referendum on both sides of the country, and there are reasons why the Republic will vote for a united Ireland, but it will be signing up to a whole heap of problems, chiefly economic problems, but political and sectarian as well. So yeah, I think that probably will happen. How do they become unignorable? In Scotland's case, I think the problem is that they become unignorable when votes for the SNP are added to Labour votes to keep the Conservative government out, which you saw weaponised, didn't you, in 2015?
Yeah.
Very much weaponised by that Conservative rhetoric. The problem with that from Labour's point of view is that it might get you over an electoral line, but you then have to deliver on a referendum, which may go in a UK splitting way. So you end up being... So that's how Scotland becomes unignorable, by becoming kingmaker in a British election. But of course, then you have the spectre of the referendum possibly breaking up the country, which I don't think any British party leader would want in the foreseeable future. I can't see certainly not a Labour or a Conservative leader being in favour of Scottish independence anytime soon.
Just a final comment from Vivian. There are a couple others, but about the position of the UK and even Scotland wouldn't have to go to the back of the queue to rejoin the EU as such, because basically at the moment we're aligned, but obviously we're becoming less aligned as time goes on with all the changes they're putting through.
We'd still be at the back of the queue, but it would be easier to achieve than it would be if we were coming from a place where we didn't have regulatory alignment and we hadn't been living for 50 years under the same framework that we have been. And we're back to Jacob Rees-Mogg and the other vandals who are, charged with the problem they've got is finding anything they can sell to the British public as being a measurable improvement, which is why they've come up so far with absolutely nothing that they can sell as a measurable improvement. It's why national newspapers, the best-selling newspaper in the country, is reduced to printing lies about stamps, crown stamps, pint glasses, because there is nothing. They lie about the vaccine procurement, it's a blatant, barefaced lie, still in the Daily Telegraph comment pages today by a professor of history at Oxford or Cambridge, just writing lies because the government, because Boris Johnson has created this environment where the truth is negotiable, just like Donald Trump did, and when was it Kellyanne Conway who came out and talked about alternative facts? We're now in the world of alternative facts, which we used to call lies, and they were resignation issues, but they're not anymore. So, it's a cheery one, this.
Right, I'm going to hand you back to Jenny then.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, my next question is kind of related. Like, do you ever get tired of the culture wars? And like, do you think it will end with a change of government?
I know. I think that people underestimate because we're so inured to it and we're so used to it, and I would be. And remember, I started my career on Fleet Street, and if I'd never got off Fleet Street, I sometimes dread to think what might have become of me professionally, what I might have ended up convincing myself was acceptable and even necessary to do professionally. It's our media. It's our disgusting Rupert Murdoch, Viscount Rothermere, Barclay Brothers, Spectator magazine, Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph, Sun, flavoured media. We're a gaslit nation. We don't know whether we're up or down on that. So regardless of who's in power, as long as you can sell, and it's a dwindling market, but you then have the even more toxic online presences stepping into exactly the same pace, peddling hatred, peddling division, peddling bigotry, prejudice, racism. It's a lucrative business. And now you've got this new culture war grift, which is peddling fear, like telling people that they're supposed to be terrified. So, it was Muslims for a long time. We're supposed to be terrified of Muslims because some people claiming to act in the name of Islam were doing atrocious things. Somehow every Muslim in the country or every Muslim trying to get into America becomes culpable. That went mainstream very quickly, but then the atrocities tailed off, and it turned out that we weren't all being taken over and we weren't all going to be subjected to Sharia law. So rather than give their heads a wobble and go, gosh, maybe we all got a bit overexcited about that, they went, shucks, that business model is suffering a bit. I'm not going to be able to raise money or sell books or garner votes by terrifying people about the non-existent threat posed by the Muslims working in their local accountancy office or running their local shop. What can we do next? And they've come up with this culture of the anti-woke, whatever the flip that's supposed to mean. No one's really been able to tell me. And it is just another attempt to say you are under threat. It's like Chicken Licken. You remember the tale of Chicken Licken? A little chicken walking through the forest and an acorn lands on her head. And she thinks the sky is falling in. And she goes to go and see the king to tell the king that the sky is falling in. And every other animal she meets in the forest buys into it. They're all terrified the sky's falling in. The sky wasn't falling in. An acorn landed on her head. But, that antidote to 60, 70% of the UK media is one that much of the public doesn't currently have access to. So no, I don't think the culture wars will go away. And no, I never get tired of it because it's like Tony Benn said, you never win. You never win and you never lose. All you can ever do is keep pushing back against the forces of regression, the forces of repression, the forces of oppression. Look at abortion in America. Thought that was done and dusted. Everyone thought that was done and dusted. Roe versus Wade was decades ago. That battle has been won. And you talk to someone like Margaret Atwood, who I interviewed for Full Disclosure during lockdown, or you look back over the words of someone like Tony Benn, and you realise the history of humanity is a history of tension between those who would be fascists, if you want to go back to that word, and those who would resist it furiously. And you never win. All you can do is keep resisting. Keep pushing back. You score small victories, you score big victories, but you never score a total victory because some little character over there will start a little political party or start complaining about people speaking foreign on trains or start claiming that sexuality is of a certain kind of deviant or start claiming that people who have have more right to be here than other people do and that the people who have less right to be here are stealing the legacies and the birthrights of the people. It's always going to happen and you always have to push back against it and you can never get tired of it because it's an existential fight for decency.
There's a grassroots movement in Germany at the moment where journalists are going into schools and teaching children like the principles of journalism, so fact checking, that kind of thing, comparing the sources. And so it's to combat fake news and teach pupils how to recognize it. Do you think that such a thing is possible in this country?
In this country, I think they need to do it at the other end of the generational scale. I think they need to send people into, I don't know what would be the sort of gathering points for the older generations to be taught how to do that. I think the schools are doing quite a good job of it at the moment. They're teaching truth, they're teaching reality, and of course that brings us back to the anti-woke thing. It freaks out the reactionaries and the bigots. They hate the idea that children are being taught to be thoughtful and to be taught critical thinking and being taught about proper history and being taught about some of the atrocities upon which some of the triumphs of empire, the so-called triumphs of empire, were built. It scares the bejesus out of older people. Younger people seem to be fairly clear-eyed about it all. But yeah, obviously in general, any antidote to the... Again, I come back to any antidote to living in a country where the best-selling newspaper can put a blatant lie on its front page. 6 years after they won a referendum, they're still lying about the prizes, and that is something that needs to be addressed from probably within education, because no billionaire is ever going to come around and dedicate comparable sums of money to accruing power designed to serve the interests of the people instead of the interests of the proprietors.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. We're just almost running out of time. We'll just see if we can take one or two more questions from social media.
Of course.
Yep. We have another one from Bill, which is interesting. Do you buy into the current theory that the Johnson administration is relying on trashing the policies of the previous Tory administrations? I'm going to add my personal one. Do you think they're spending so much money that when Labour do, or when the coalition that comes in the future has to take over, they're going to be saddled with £500 billion worth of debt?
It's a thought. I don't know. I gave up some time ago thinking there was a master plan. Even in even in the context of dead cats, I don't really think that they are dead cats in the sense of being an alternative to chaos. I think the best way to understand it, and everyone is enthralled to Johnson now. They've all sold their souls to him, including Rishi Sunak. Everything is now about what gets him through the day. It's got nothing to do with next week or next month. Sunak didn't want to bring in a windfall tax.
No.
The economic arguments for a windfall tax are at the very best mixed. You know, the likelihood of having to do something similar again at some point 6 months down the line is very high. It's not good politics in long-term measures, but it was desperately needed last week because Johnson's law breaking and lying was dominating the news agenda, even with the connivance of a largely client media, you know, a Mail and a Sun. It's to a lesser extent now the Telegraph actually on the news pages, but the Mail and the Sun still abnegating any sense of journalistic duty and working essentially as state propagandists. So they needed something to distract people from so-called Partygate. So they came up with the windfall tax. But, you know, you've still got Conservative MPs. One of them, to take it back to Empire, one of them whose fortune was built upon slaver ancestors, started talking about how the windfall tax went against what Conservatives stand for because it was telling businesses what to do with their profits and preventing them from keeping as much as they want. So no, I don't think there's some master plan to denude the Labour Party of a policy platform or to lumber them with an economic crisis if they win the next election. I think everything makes sense if you just see it all as a short-term Boris Johnson serving government. It exists for no other reason than to prolong the survival and inflate the self-regard of Boris Johnson. That's the only reason this government exists. Once you understand that, a lot of the stuff that seems mad, it doesn't seem any more palatable or more pleasant, but it seems a lot less mad. Understand that and you understand everything. And that's why Dominic Cummings is now embarked upon a kind of Aristotelian exercise in hubris and nemesis, because he can see it so clearly now, and he was a key part of making it happen. But he thought he was so clever, he'd somehow be able to ride the narcissist into Downing Street and then do such things when he got there, such nation-changing, constitution reforming things, because he was such a genius. He was just another mark, another mug that got sucked in by a narcissist and spat out again when he'd served his purpose. And that's what the United Kingdom is now. Just another mug, another mark that's been sucked in by Boris Johnson's narcissism and is now in the process of being spat out again.
I do just want to finish up by saying there's a lot of love for you on our messages today. So thank you. We really appreciate you coming on, as I'm sure Jenny will say that too. So thank you from me.
Yeah, obviously that's true. Yeah, I just have one last question. How do you recommend that, like, say, groups like ours kind of campaign going forward, or what should we focus on to keep the kind of connections with the EU and keep the momentum?
Well, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because there's two sides to that coin. One is extolling the benefits of membership by pointing out the price of losing them, and I think that's important. That can be draining. You know, that's a little bit like, I remember in Bullseye when people didn't win the prize and Jim Bowen would say, have a look at what you could have won. Yeah. And it was one of the cruelest things ever to happen in the history of television. You'd have some poor sod who thought they were about to win a speedboat, and they're going home with a tankard and a set of darts, and then they bring on the speedboat and they bring on the caravan or they bring on the car to show them what they could have won. But you need to do a lot of this is what you could have won. And then, well, actually, that's probably the major part of the mission at the moment. And when people are clear about what they've lost, then you can start the business of working out how we go about getting it back again.
Amazing. Thanks very much. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure having you on our show.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. And I recommend that everybody listens to your show and reads all your books, definitely going forward.